everyone, to the sixth episode now of Wrestling with Our Faith. I am Chris, and this is my wonderful co-host Josh. How you doing today, Josh?
I am pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been another long week of preparation for the Christmas play, but it's been a good week. So lots been accomplished. We had our first run through last night with kids.
How'd it go?
It went well. They did a great job. So it's probably been one of the best first dress rehearsals we've had
Really?
in a while. Yeah. So I was very encouraged by it. Doing a lot of different new things this year from a tech standpoint. So there was some of that we had to work out, and that all went well. And it's fantastic. Can't wait to see it on Sunday and do it. And can't wait for it to be over too.
Exciting stuff.
Because I'm tired. Yeah, I'd like to get back to a normal sleep and work schedule.
No, that's not gonna happen.
Normal, I said, not great.
Okay,
Normal. Yes, getting home at midnight and being up at 6 a.m. is not what I like to do on a regular basis. But I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for listening again. And I just want to remind everyone that we have our little challenge out there for people to win a $50 Amazon gift card. All you have to do for that is sign up on our YouTube page, hit subscribe, hit a like, and leave us a comment. We want to know what you're thinking, how we're doing. If you have anything on any of our videos, the topic, an opinion on that, let us know. We can always revisit a topic in the future. So if you have a comment, that's something we'll definitely take note of. And if when we revisit something maybe in the future, we can bring up something that we may not have thought of the first time around. So make sure you do that. And like I say, we will pick one person at random at the once we hit 50 subscribers, and that person will win a $50 Amazon gift card. And right now we've had 2 people who have met the criteria and are qualified. Lots of people, up to 31 subscribers, get a handful of likes every week, but no one likes to leave a comment. So make sure you leave that comment. It helps us out knowing how we're doing, and it helps you participate in our podcast.
There are no bad comments unless we tell you it's a bad comment.
As long as it's respectful, you're not disrespecting somebody, all comments are good. For the most part, probably. Just in case I'm missing something I'm not thinking of right now. Because you say that, and then somebody will think of something and be like, yeah, I should have thought of that. But so this week we are kind of continuing on from our conversation of last week and just getting a little more specific. Last week we had the discussion of evolution versus creation, and kind of walk through both of those and what each side says. And I think some of the main things we came to were whatever side you choose, both sides take a matter of faith. Science can't prove or disprove one or the other, but it takes a matter of faith and looking at the facts and each side of the argument and coming down to what you feel is the best case. And for both of us, we both obviously fall on the creation side, and that's what adds up and makes sense to us. So this week we're going to talk more about the specifically the biblical creation and kind of walking through that. There's some different thoughts on that between young Earth and old Earth, and just the literary style, and there's just a whole bunch of different things. I mean, we could probably have several episodes on this and biblical creation, because there's just a lot packed into there. So we're just going to walk through that, and depending on how we go, maybe we'll have to do a second week of this if we don't feel we get to everything. But we'll do the best we can. And if you're watching on Twitch, make sure you leave us comments. We are keeping an eye on those. I have my screen up right now, and I had my screen up. There it is. So we'll see those as we're talking. We'll try to address stuff you guys. If you have questions or comments on what we're talking about, we can address that in our discussion, because like I said, we want you to join in on our discussion, whether it's after the fact through comments on our social media accounts or if you're watching us live on Twitch and participating with us live, the more of a discussion we have on these topics, the better. Because say no one person is going to be able to think of everything to say or talk about or all that. So, so I'm going to toss it to Josh real quick and to give us when it comes to the biblical creation, what's your initial thoughts?
My initial thought, I have a problem with the foundation of the argument, but I agree with the science behind it.
Okay.
So, answers in Genesis, right? It'll stand from a fundamentalist perspective that the creation story in Genesis is inherently true because it's God ordained. That means everything that you read in the Old Testament or anything that you read in the Bible is factual.
Right.
I know that you and I have a hard time with that because going through classes and classes of information, reading books, most of Genesis appears to be in a form of some poetic writing style.
Right, where I would say, yes, what I've read is, especially the creation count, is poetic prose, would be the exact type of writing style, which is a poetic version of a historical event. So it's not, so sometimes poetry could be about just a metaphorical event or a philosophical thing, where in Genesis it's about something historical, but it's written not as a exact factual, like a history book.
There are historical elements to it, but it's not.
Yeah. Yes. And I don't even know if this is even 100% accurate, but to me, like the best example I could give would be Homer's the Odyssey, I think it's, or the Iliad, whichever one's about the Trojan War. I can't remember right now.
Okay.
Where people, especially now, they believe that the Trojan War was a historical event, and this is Homer wrote in poetic form, to where he's talking about a historical event, but it's poetry.
Right. I mean, so last week we talked about evolution and creation, and we said with a intellectual being creating all of this, of course, yeah, Genesis could happen. One of the creation stories could have happened the exact way that it's talked about.
Right.
I have no problem with answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, a lot of those things.
Yep.
I don't have a problem with the science that he uses because a lot of it adds up, and a lot of it is. I mean, I would say most of it is proven. I have a hard time with the literature about it. So we've talked about how there are in Genesis 1, you have one creation story, and then in Genesis 2, you have another creation story. That's tough if you're saying that the Bible in of itself is 100% accurate, because you can't have a creation twice.
Right.
That doesn't make sense, especially when those things don't line up. I mean, if you read it, Genesis 1 has the days listed out, and it has specific events happening on each day, correlating. So 1, 2, and 3, what happens on day 1 correlates to day 4. What happens on day 2 correlates to day 5, and what happens on day 3 correlates to day 6. And it's all in that section. Whereas in Genesis 2, there's a different narrative. It's God going through a process of problem solving. He's figuring out what he needs to make for man so that man is satisfied.
Right. Yeah, and from my studies of Genesis, one of the things that I've noticed, and it's when I take it into context, is we got to remember who's writing it, who they're writing it to, and this is being written so much later than, they say that, Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament.
Yeah, tradition would dictate that.
Right. So that's the time period we're talking of when this stuff is being written, sometime after the Exodus and before Moses dies. So when you think about that, he's writing to the Israelites of that time, and you have to take into account what they're going through and that type of stuff. So that plays into who it's written for and what they're going through. Remember, they've been in Egyptian captivity for 400 years. So they've just been bombarded with Egyptian religion, Egyptian culture, and all that type of stuff. Plus, there's probably some influences of other civilizations, um, Mesopotamian civilizations,
Babylon.
Right. So there's a whole bunch of that, and when you take that into account, a lot of the things that are being talked about in Genesis, and especially the first chapter of Genesis, are you can see them making reference to other different accounts of the creation story.
Right.
So, and in those other creation stories, it was these different types of gods who were created compared to differently where the Israel God was from the very beginning, which is what it says, in Genesis 1:1, it alludes to in the beginning was God. So he's before all.
Right.
So in the other ones, those gods came after.
Mm-hmm.
So it challenges those other religions and their creation accounts.
So, I mean, I wrote a paper about this, and you looked at the paper. The first thing that I was talking about, I think, was Moses's authorship of the first 5 books.
Right.
Which it's weird for an author to write about his death and then continue writing. But it was held for decades that Moses was the author. And if you disagreed, in a lot of the commentaries that I was reading from like 1920s, 1930s, they were pretty much saying that you should go to hell where you belong. That was the commentary in these books if you didn't believe that Moses was the author. So recently, I think within the past 50 years, they've discovered some different texts alluding to Babylon and Macedonia having eerily identical creation stories next to our Genesis. And so the theory is that the theory that has the most evidence for it, that seems to make the most sense, is that there were these poets and authors while under Babylonian rule. They were captive. They didn't have a written history. All they had was an oral history of, you're looking at 20 generations of oral tradition being passed down. And then you have different Israelite sects coming together and then combining their creations or their stories that they have. A lot of it seems to be based on and founded on Babylon. So I think where I'm coming from, I think that Babylon had the creation story, and one argument is that Israel didn't have much of anything at that point, and a lot of their stuff was destroyed. So they took that story and added a monotheistic view of their God into that creation story. Now that travels down generations, transliteration goes through, and then you have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which are 2 different creation stories, similar to the point where God is creating it, which I think that a lot of people can agree on, and I think that's something that is definitely correct. The question then becomes, how much of which story is more accurate? How does that fit in? It's poetic. What's happening here? So then there's this idea of the redactor, this one person who is taking all these accounts, all these oral traditions in a group of people and puts them in together to formulate a story, a very well-written story of Genesis.
So I have two areas I want to touch on that. The first one is your take on the origin of it. I would say that I believe that instead of the Israelites, they had heard all these different views from a Mesopotamian or Egyptian or whatever, and when Moses came along, or whoever we're going to say the author was, for argument's sake, we'll just say Moses at this point. He came to set the record straight, and the creation account, the first chapter of that creation account, sets the record straight on who God is, the true God. So you talk about because in different parts of the the days. We'll take day 4 where where the sun, moon, and stars are created. There are certain groups in that time who worship those as gods, and so I would argue that Genesis, when it's being written, is coming along saying, no, those aren't gods like these other people are saying. The one true God made those, and they fall under his rule and domain. They serve him. And so, it's establishing, it's saying other groups are worshiping different things, saying that those are gods. And I'm here to tell you that this is the one true God, and these are what these things actually are. They were made by God, and they serve God because he's the author of all creation. And when we come down to the second point where you say we have two different creation stories, I don't think it's two different creation stories. I think it's one from two different perspectives. Where in Genesis 1, it's more of from the perspective of the world, where in Genesis 2, it's more of the perspective from man.
So they are, I think it's okay. So two different stories, or the same story split into two different sections. Still, it's a separate. It's the Jehovah's narrative and then the priestly narrative. That's the idea that comes around, is that the first story talks about how God is, and you look at the scripture, it talks about how God speaks everything into existence. Mm-hmm. He doesn't touch anything, right? He doesn't participate in, and he knows everything that it is. So when we read and God saw that it was good, a lot of people will say, oh, so God saw that what he made was pure, free from sin, it was good. Whereas the Hebrew kind of alliterates to that it was satisfactory to what God wants. Mm-hmm. So what God is creating in Genesis 1, he knows what he's going to create, right? Everything comes into order. There is an order. Genesis 1 is to tell people that there is a God who has everything in control, who is all powerful, and he sees all and knows all, and nothing surprises him. The problem with this narrative is if we believe in a God that loves us, this doesn't really fit the same God. So you have a God that is distant from his creation, one who creates but observes from a distance, won't touch. Then you have Genesis 2, which follows a completely different version of the God that we're talking about, where it's sequential. It has an order of what am I doing for man. So he creates vegetation, and he sees that it is good to eat. The reason why God sees that it is good to eat is because it's good to eat for something. God doesn't need it, but he's making sure that it's there for humankind when they're created. So both accounts, I think, tell the story of who God is, because he's all powerful and he's everywhere, but he's also the relational God who's with us.
Right, and I would say that as well. Like in the first account, that's speaking more about God's sovereignty and his rule over all. And the second account is more relational in his relationship with creation.
Mm-hmm. And so when the Israelites initially had these stories, right, these two different oral traditions, for their God to fit this description, you needed both, because he is both.
Right.
So that would be my answer as to why you have two different Genesi.
Creation accounts
written in the Bible.
Right. Yeah. I think they're different, but they're connected.
Yeah.
So I don't think you could have one. I don't think you could take one away and it be effective.
Yeah. What is it?
Like you have to have them both.
Yeah.
So I think you have an incomplete picture of who God is if you take one or the other out of that equation.
I pray to God I'm saying this right. But to kind of add proof to the poetic side, which it's hard to say poetically when you look at it and it doesn't exactly say what we're trying to say, like transliteration, it's translated so many times down.
Right.
For instance, when in Genesis 1, where and God saw that it was like empty and void. I think I talked about this. I think it's tohu vavohu, Hebrew. If I butchered that, I apologize. But its closest translation is welter and waste. And there's a rhyme scheme. You can hear it.
Right.
And it's consistent throughout all of Genesis.
Right. There's a pattern throughout Genesis. There's evening and morning, which can be translated chaos to order.
Mm-hmm.
So every day, things were brought from chaos into more order, until you get to day 7, and the order is perfect. You would say at that point, there's no more chaos. Like he's brought everything in the universe into order.
I haven't heard that before. I haven't, as far as like talking to people, that's never been, at least for me, it's always been morning and evening.
Right.
And represented in like the Hebrew text.
Right. And I've heard somebody teach on this, and I'm not going to do the same justice as he did, but it can be used as a, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, an example of a holiness lifestyle, that our life, from walking from the moment we become a Christian until the moment we go into heaven, that we're always moving from chaos into more order in our life. As we get closer to God, as we grow in our relationship with Him, we're becoming more like Him, because we're relying on Him, we're depending on Him, we're just have that deeper relationship with God. So we're working towards our Christian perfection, which isn't going to be completed until, to use a churchy word, glorification, which happens once we get to heaven, which we will be back to 100% how we were originally created to be, sin free, and our Christian walk is always to continue to move towards that.
Right.
And that's kind of like an example of that. Day 1, there's a lot of chaos, and it's brought into some order. Day 2, there's less chaos in day 1, and then that's brought into more order. And you continue that process until creation's over with, and it's brought into to no chaos anymore. It's in all order.
I think that makes a good sermon, but I don't think that was the intent of
and like I say, I don't know if that's the intent of why it was written, but that's a talking point that I've heard. And again, like, the Bible written as a whole should always be pointing towards the overall message, points to the same thing, and that type of thing falls in line. So I would imagine that there's some type of truth in that, and whether that was the intent for the people at that time, but to say that God had His hand in it to where it's written like that, to in a post-Jesus world, that still fits and makes sense.
I think you can make it make sense. But as far as like the point of that, a lot of scholars for ancient design have talked about how, for a earlier civilization, to look at things, and there's some parts in Genesis when you look at the Hebrew, which I can't go into context right now. One, because I don't know the words.
Right.
But the Earth is considered to be it was considered to be flat by design. And for them, the concept of evening and morning to relate around the sun, which wasn't even created until day 4. There are some things in the story that don't make complete sense, that don't follow a specific order. But for ancient Israel to be looking towards a Christian sense, these ancient authors, I think we could make sermons out of it, but I think it's painful hermeneutics to go past that.
Right. And I understand what you're saying. Yes. Some of this is just theoretical.
But for poetry, there is actual poetry. Like, there are rhyme schemes, and there are orders. Everything follows a certain time. Like, evening and morning is constantly mentioned. It's written practically identical the whole way through.
And how day 1 and, like you said, day 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6 tie into each other. It's another poetic type of writing style. So so there's a lot that goes into that.
I don't think, So Genesis, for me, and I don't know which one I would lean more towards as being like the accurate description of how Genesis is, like how actual creation took place. One has so much order to it. I like the way it sounds, but I also like two. They're both necessary stories to describe who God is. Some variation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the closest that I can ever come to, is that it's some variation of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2.
Right.
Um, yeah. Evidential, like scientific wise.
Mm-hmm.
The numbers about it, because there's the thought of like an old Earth or young Earth.
Right, and I was going to bring that up. Yes, we have this old Earth, young Earth controversy and what people believe. Some people believe that it was the young Earth side says that creation was a literal 7 days, and old Earth people would say that it's not a literal 7 days. That those days are just used as context for the poetic portion of it, and then that God did did what he did, but it just took place over however much time, because God doesn't operate in time, and that's one of their arguments that they have. They say God doesn't operate in time, and time doesn't, even in the creation account, time doesn't even exist until day 4.
So is this the old Earth?
This would be the old Earth, yes. So there's this dynamic that people go through, and the one thing is the Bible doesn't tell us.
Is it yam or tam for day? So
yes.
An argument for like creation would be that same Hebrew word is used every single time when day is mentioned anywhere else, and it is always correlating to a 24-hour day. For me, it's the tools given to you. You're going to use what you know.
Actually, it's not. It is used in places in the Old Testament for meaning time period. This is coming from my Hebrew teacher in college.
All right.
That it is used at times in the Old Testament for a time period. She gave me some examples that I cannot remember at this time. This is like 7 years ago.
Right.
But yeah, so yes, there was times when it was used for a time period of a long period of time. Like I think at one point it was like 1,000 years.
So the rabbi that I was talking about, when we were it's not that it was specifically mentioning, and I've never heard of a period of time. I've heard of as days, but only because you can only use what tools that you have at your disposal to describe what's going on. So for them to describe evening and morning in a place where there's no evening and morning, they have to think, okay, what would we put there? Evening and morning. That makes the most sense because that's what we're used to. So I don't think that 24-hour day is an argument that can be made, because the ancient Israelites are only going to use what they have at their disposal. I've never heard of that word meaning more than 24 hours. Not to be specific, like in another general sense, it's just a day is a day. And like you said, I don't think that necessarily means that God had to do it all in one day. Although if we believe in an all-powerful God, then 6 days is possible. It's just a different places of how we feel or where we believe on it. So
yeah, because like I say, you get the non-literal people who they bring up that if time doesn't exist till day 4, how would God create? Why would God use a 24-hour period time frame when time doesn't exist till later?
It was the tools that I think they had.
Right. So, which again, I don't know if it means, like I say, whatever way, it doesn't, nothing specific. So none of Genesis tells us exactly how things are done. So even if you take, say, whether you believe it's a literal or non-literal, we'll take, one of the days. Well, how did it happen that day? When God spoke, was it done automatically? Did it take the entire time period? Like there's so many things we don't know. Like we're trying to fill in the gaps because we, as people, we want to know the answers.
And I think we could break it down into even smaller questions. Like we go beyond that and power through the details. But the truth is there aren't answers that, like you said, there aren't answers that we have to these questions, and trying to solve it isn't going to get us anywhere.
Right. Which is why I always believe that the most important thing you can get away from the creation account of Genesis is the very first verse, where in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe that, it doesn't matter. The rest, how it happened, doesn't matter, whether it's a literal or non-literal 7 days, or how things happened in those, that, was it automatic? Did it take time or whatever? Like, the hows don't matter as long as you get the who did it, and that who is real.
So I'm looking at it a little backwards. So a fundamentalist argument for why it's important to have creation be 100% accurate is because when you look at the Bible, the very first chapter is Genesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Genesis would be your foundation. And if people can come in and attack your foundation, then everything else crumbles.
Right.
I have a hard time with that order. I think there is a foundation, but I don't think it's Genesis. As far as like a Christian standpoint goes, for us the foundation is Jesus, right? Everything that he did, his teachings, that's the foundation. And if you believe that Jesus did the miracles that he said he did, if he's the God that we say he is, part of the Trinitarian covenant, then everything else is easily believable if you believe that Jesus was able to do the things that he did. If it's an all-powerful God with Jesus, then everything else falls into place. But without Jesus, then the argument of Genesis is, it's regardless, we don't even need it.
Right. And like I say, when you, even from that viewpoint, Jesus fully believed in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, he came to fulfill all Scripture, every jot and tittle, and so, which means all of Scripture is 100% real. Like I say, there's different writing elements, and like we've talked about before, so it doesn't mean it's an exact literal thing, but it's conceptually, it's real.
Mm-hmm.
Creation happened. Yahweh God is who created. Like, that's the point that is to be taken from that.
Mm-hmm.
And like I say, that's what Jesus fully believed, that he believed Abraham was a real person. All of that Jewish history, like, he believes 100% that was real, and said that. So to believe in Jesus means to believe in the Old Testament. So it means even you're talking Jonah and the whale. Sounds like an odd story. Again, there's a whole lot you could unpack in that, but I don't know exactly what happened, but that happened. The hows of that, how that all transpired, is because there's some people I've heard talk about that Jonah may have died. It went to, because the same word, and I can't remember, is the same word that's translated Sheol. So he went to Sheol and then was spit back out on the dry land. He was, brought back to earth, from Sheol. So there's was he alive in the whale? Was he not? Like, it doesn't matter. Do I believe that happened? Yes, because Jesus said it happened. So that's kind of my take on that.
That's comfortable. I like that. I'm comfortable with that.
Right.
So, I said earlier, I have a hard time with looking at the literature of Genesis and stating that is evidence for a young Earth. I would say that there is actual scientific evidence for a young Earth, leaning more towards a young Earth.
Okay.
I have a hard time with saying that Genesis is designed to be proof of a young Earth. That's not what Genesis is intended for. We went through the intentions. It was to describe Genesis 1, a God who is all-powerful. And then Genesis 2, a God who was caring of humanity. And then also, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right. The key point. I would say that there is a lot of science leaning towards that, as far as more science leaning towards a young Earth than an old Earth. Okay. That has been presented.
So would you say that then there's some science that suggests an old Earth?
None that I've seen that's been accurate. So you have the carbon dating, which is the most commonly used. And there's specific, there are different kinds that you can use, different rocks.
Right. And yeah, there's definitely issues with carbon dating.
Right. So before I came, I looked up one study for a Dr. Andrew A. Snelling, PhD in geology. He was hired on as a doctor for Answers in Genesis and was just doing research. And I went through, And in New Zealand, there's a mountain, Mount Naruhoe. It's an active volcano with visible creation of rocks
Right.
from the actual magma. So what happened over the past, I think, 50 years, lava would pour out and it would cool and it would become rocks, and you could visibly see the magma become rocks.
Right.
So over the past 50 years, they took samples and then sent it out to labs, right? And these labs, highly regarded, I think, in Cambridge. So they had these rocks. They started to use their tools of measurement. They were going through the years, and mind you, these rocks, 50 years old.
Right.
Their youngest that they got, because they had 5 samples, their youngest, I think, was around 270 to 290,000 years old.
Okay.
And then their max was 3.5, give or take 0.2.
Right.
Sorry, 3.5 million. So you have visible evidence, like, and so we talked about earlier about the visual, you can see it happening, or you have with this there's observable, or is it historical? Could be having that wrong, but observable science is the best way to define
Obviously,
something.
yes.
You have visible rocks being 50 years old, and the data that we're using is saying that it's 3.5 million years old.
Right.
That's killer, man.
Yeah.
Because everybody's believing in this one system, and mind you, that is only one. That's one form, right?
Right.
Well, that's only one form of carbon dating,
right?
Because there are others, and it's all about the gas. This one specifically, what do they use?
The carbon-14?
Argon.
Argon? Okay.
Yeah. And so, and that's specifically used for lava rocks.
Okay.
So, and Answers in Genesis kind of breaks it down, and their science, I feel like some of it, it's hard because they base it so much off of Genesis, which I'm like, you can't do that because that's not what Genesis is for. It's not who it was written for.
Right.
I believe you have the science to prove it. I don't think you are using the correct source to make your science known. And if anything, this just proves that evolution isn't possible without faith.
Right. Yes. And I guess for me, like that type of scientific things, I'm looking for it more as a confirmation of creation, not a confirmation of how creation was done.
Yeah.
Because again, to me, whether it was literal or non-literal, it absolutely doesn't matter.
It happened.
It's just not going to change my faith. Even if they came down and said like 100%, we know exactly how creation happened, and it's a young Earth, doesn't change my faith at all. And if they came down and said just the opposite, that creation absolutely happened by God and it's an old Earth, doesn't change my faith any bit at all. But if some of that science, if it helps point to confirming creation, that's a bigger thing in my book, because I think that means more to somebody who's maybe sitting on the fence. I think it's more important for somebody sitting on the fence to know that there was a God who created, not how it was done. Like that's more important to somebody, I think, who hasn't made that up their mind yet. And you're going to get people who are on the other side who are just dead set on evolution. It doesn't matter what the science is going to say, because they're going to twist that to their own, to say what they need it to say. And I think sometimes some creationists do the same thing too, where they try to twist the science. Right. They twist the science to say things were created how they wanted it to be created.
The 24-hour days.
Right. That's where I think people get into a bind. And that's, I think, where when Ken Ham debated Bill Nye, I think that's where he got into a bind, and why I feel that he didn't do a good job is because he's so dead set on it has to be a literal 7-day creation. I think he backed himself into a corner. And if he would just taken the philosophy of, I think it was a literal 7-day creation, and from what I've seen, but it's an all-powerful God who could have done it And if the science bears that out, well, then maybe I need to rethink what how it was done. But the science is showing that there was a creator, and God was the creator.
Fair enough.
And I think that's, if he would have taken that approach, I think he just blows Bill Nye out of the water. Like, I don't think it's even close.
So I think it was a little skewed towards in favor of Bill Nye to begin with. One, because Answers in Genesis isn't as well known as Bill Nye, and
Right.
so the arguments that Ken Ham has been creating for decades now, they're not well known.
Mhm.
I feel like he had to spend so much time defending himself and putting out the information that he's already had for years, but people just don't know it because they don't listen. So I feel like he had to
Right.
spend so much time telling everybody, hey, this is what it is, and defending himself from the basic attacks that most evolutionists that Bill Nye agrees with are usually sending out.
Mhm.
I would say that he would probably be defending himself regardless of the stance that he took. But I think, and the argument for sticking with the fundamentalist 6-day creation, 7th-day rest, there's a statistic out there like 70% of college kids, high school kids, leave the church after they turn 18. I don't know if this study was directly because of science. So if they hear that what they've been taught up from kids' church moving on up, that everything in it was a story, and then there's evolutionary evidence for there not being a creator. Well, then why am I believing in a God when this doesn't make sense?
Right.
And so when I look at Genesis, and I'm taking classes from a rabbi, a very educated man, and he's going through this story and he's talking about the poetic elements, I'm realizing more and more that Genesis is not a kid's story. It's not meant for kids.
Right.
It's meant for, I mean, it's a literature masterpiece. There's so many detailed things in it, and if we just took it away from, I would say, teaching it as a story or teaching it as something that it's not, people are gonna hold on to that, and when they're taught something different that makes more sense, then they're gonna go with that.
Right. And I think where the disconnect, I think because you have to teach it in a way for kids to understand it. But where the failure and the disconnect comes from is as those kids getting older, giving them a much older and better lesson on it, and bringing in some of that stuff that you're talking about. So, I mean, it does somebody nothing when they turn 18 and they're still being taught about creation and that type of stuff from a child's perspective. Like, it's the same thing you're teaching somebody who's in elementary school. Like, that just doesn't do somebody good. Like, you're not when you go to school, you're not learning the same things in high school as you did in elementary for a reason. Like, you may be building on the things that you learned in elementary in high school. So the things that you learned, you've been built upon over the years, and now you have a much bigger picture view of things and understanding of things because it's been built upon. And I think that's where the church may fail, is we teach the basic things to kids, but we don't continually build upon it as they're moving up and getting older. So they have this very basic understanding of it when they're 18 and they're graduating and they're leaving the church, and they have this basic. So then when you do go out into, say, a college and you hear other things, that's really going to shake your faith if you just have this basic elementary school understanding of creation and other biblical concepts. Like, it's going to be easy to take a college educated reasoning and shake that faith.
I kind of lean, I agree with a lot of that. Something that hits me off, the Bible talks about it being a very narrow path. 70% sounds like a wide path perspective. So I don't think it's exactly 70% because science is more right, or they look at what their schools are teaching them. Because we talked about it, like what the schools teach and the stuff that we talked about, it's garbage. I don't think it's that. I think it's an excuse. It's a Band-Aid over the real problem, which I don't know if I can say that is the church's problem, but it's, again, that foundation that I said, that's not Genesis, it's Jesus.
Right.
If Jesus is your foundation, not a lot of hardly anything should be able to knock that, right?
Hmm.
So I don't want to say that it's like the church's fault for not teaching Genesis. I don't think it's the church's fault for not teaching Jesus. I think that there's probably a period of doubt in a lot of people's lives.
Hmm.
And I don't know, biblically, I have no evidence of this. But often I really do see when people get older, they stray away and find themselves coming back.
Hmm.
Regardless of the time, it seems like from what I've seen, the age, there are different levels
Hmm.
at different ages.
Okay.
So I see a lot of people walking away
Hmm.
at a certain age.
Right.
And then you see a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm coming back,"
Hmm.
or "It's been so long and I feel like I need to come back."
Hmm.
I don't think it's the science. I think it's just a faith. I think it's time for God to work, and that could be something that I need to look more into. But
Right.
that's kind of where I'm at.
And I think there's some of that too. Um, I think there's, like I say, I don't think it's all the church's responsibility.
Hmm.
I think the church does have a responsibility to disciple people, as from young to old, and not necessarily by age wise, but that may be from young Christian to old Christian.
That makes more sense. Yeah.
Because even if you have somebody who's 25 who never went to church and just decided to come to church and became a Christian, like you still have to start out with that very basic fundamental stuff and then build upon that. So it's not an age thing; it's a Christian maturity type thing, and it's the church's responsibility to disciple those people from young baby Christians into mature, older, Christians.
Hmm.
But I think there's also the personal responsibility of somebody saying, "This is what I'm choosing to do. I'm choosing to follow God. I'm choosing to believe
Hmm.
in God." And just from my own perspective, like there is a 10-year period in my life where I didn't go to church. At no point did I not believe there wasn't a God. But during that time period, I made the choice that I wasn't going to follow God.
Hmm.
I still believe there was a God, and I believe that at some point I was going to um, step back into my faith.
And I'm not looking to take away from that experience.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that mindset, that tenure,
Mm-hmm.
happens more often than I think people are willing to talk about. I think a majority of Christians are going to experience that around an age when more freedom is granted, however that
Right.
looks.
And I think for me, that period of my life happened is because I knew if I was going to follow God, the lifestyle that I was going to have to choose to live. And I didn't want to choose to live that lifestyle. I say it had nothing to do with believing in God or anything like that. It was, I knew I didn't want to choose to live that lifestyle. And it wasn't until I was ready to step into and live that lifestyle that's when I came back.
Yeah.
And start, my faith journey again. Because like I say, I knew, and part of that was growing up in the church my whole life, like people did a good job of teaching me that. And through whatever circumstances, I'm just like, I don't want to live that lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And then roughly 10 years later, I'm like, okay, like, God's calling me. Like, I can see instances throughout that he never left me throughout that time period.
Right.
He was always keeping certain people in my life who were always, there to kind of keep nudging me, from straying way too far away. And I was cognizant of that. Like I could see it, not necessarily maybe in that moment, but maybe a year or two later, I could see that. Like, um, and maybe that's why when it happened, I was open to allowing myself to be corralled a little bit instead of just veering way far off.
Mm-hmm.
And like I say, and because of that, I knew that there's a time. That time hit, and I'm like, it's time to go back. And there was no like, ooh, I don't want to live this type of life. No, it was like, it's what I'm doing. Like that's done, and this is the new way. But that was a choice that had to be made.
Yeah.
And I think until somebody's ready to make that choice, you can't force them to make it, or anything like that. They have to make that choice on their own. So do you have any, I mean, I have a topic I want to talk about, but we're already at 50 minutes, so I don't know if I want to delve into this week.
We can save it for next week.
I mean, do you have anything along this topic, that you want to bring up that, along with what we've been talking about?
I would say through, because I feel like it's a point in a lot of people's lives. There are unique situations for each person that bring it about, but the thing that is consistent is that there is this separation from God, not by God's choosing, but by our choosing.
Right.
And I would say that I feel like even if if I'm cognizant of that, if I see that happening, I still need to be weary of myself, not to separate myself. I don't know. Like I said, I think I agree more that it's not like a specific age of a person. It's an age in their spirituality. I think just a warning that the world is going to look very enticing. There are a lot of things in the world that, what is it? Genesis 3, fall of man, where it talks about, or our concept of, for me, free will comes into play. And I think we talked about this like first or second, but you don't know how good God is until you see the other option.
Right.
You have to experience, I feel like, the world and all of its lust, sinfulness, not actually go out and be lustful and sinful. But I mean, we can easily see the world around us and see what's wrong with it.
Right.
I feel like free will is choosing God over all those other things, which brings about genuine worship. So I would say that the evil is necessary only to show us the other option that is not God.
I don't know if I would say it was necessary, but because that is something that I've thought of, because obviously Adam and Eve sinned, and so because of that, all of humanity has a sinful nature. So I always wondered if there was, say, Adam and Eve had a child before they sinned, the descendants of Adam and Eve would have that sinful nature, but would that third person who didn't sin have that sinful nature, and would their descendants, because they chose not to sin?
And so comes to the concept of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Whether two options, either A, there was a tree that had a fruit that had magical properties that bestowed upon the person who ate it the knowledge of good and evil, or if it was somewhat of a seal, God says, don't do this. And in breaking the one thing that you were not supposed to break, the one option to actually disobey God, if it broke the seal of sin that entered the world. So it could, and depending on how you think about it, it could either be that sin entered into them, or sin entered, which I like the thought. I like the thought of magical properties.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That I mean, yeah, I don't know what to think of that initially. That's something I'd have to.
We can talk about it next time.
I mean, yeah, we can explore some of that more, and then my other hypothesis that
I'm super stoked for that.
Which, yeah, it's just, I think it's an interesting topic. It's just something, as I was doing my study of Genesis and the creation account, that just had a thought, and it's an interesting thought. I have no proof for it, or I can't back it up biblically, and there's nothing biblically to back it up. But just an idea that I have. So just to tease you guys with that, and just wonder for. Luckily, we're running behind this week, so if we're on schedule next week, you don't have to wait a full week to hear it.
Oh my goodness.
You only got to wait part of a week to hear it. So you do luck out there. if
exams, man, we're
we
close.
we record on time, but sorry about that, guys. It's been crazy time around the holidays here, and with Josh and schooling and finals and exams and projects and stuff. So hopefully, once the holidays are over, it'll be
back on a solid schedule.
Bit easier to stay on a stricter schedule, and some of it's been just the ability to use the space that we use to record too. Other people have been using the building for other ministry type stuff, so unfortunately we just didn't have the option to record even if we were available. So a lot of things going on personally and just in the church that has just made things kind of crazy the past couple of weeks, but we will eventually get back on a consistent schedule. And but we appreciate everyone listening. So I just want to let everyone know about our social media accounts, and so I'll put those up on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube. But again, we are planning on recording live on Tuesdays on Twitch, and you can look us up there at twitch.tv at Wrestling with Our Faith, and you can also watch our videos that we record on YouTube, and they're usually up on YouTube a couple hours or so after we're finished recording. It's just a matter of doing some quick editing real quick, just to make things all nice and put a pretty bow on it, and get it rendered and uploaded. So you can catch us there on YouTube, and remember to give us a subscribe, give us a like, and leave us a comment to be entered into our contest for a $50 Amazon gift card once we hit 50 subscribers. And you can also catch us on Instagram at Wrestling with Our Faith, on Twitter at Wrestling Hour. And if you also want to look at our Patreon account, we have some ways that you can help support us there if you are interested and inclined. And so it's so we have that. Like I say, supporting us on social media is great. We want to hear from you guys, see what you guys think. I think there's a lot on this topic that people have opinions on. So hopefully we hear quite a bit from you guys on what you guys think and what we had to say and stuff like that. So, So what do you have planned the rest of this week, Josh?
Exams, final papers.
Fun stuff. I mean, it's what you live for, isn't it?
It's not like a final exam week. It's like a final exam 2 weeks, and I don't understand why.
I just love college. I'm so glad I'm done with it. For now, maybe. There's always the option to go back
always the option
for graduate school and
suffer some more.
Exactly. And that's always been in the back of my mind to go back to get my master's. But
if you're a glutton for punishment, college is the place for you. You have to pay it off for the rest of your life as well.
Yeah, don't get me started on college and
the gift that keeps on giving.
The cost and the whole system that is, I think the way it's set up is so terrible. But yeah, I'll just let that go. So again, thank you guys for listening. We look forward to seeing you guys next week. Talk to you later. Peace.